Okay, now colleagues, please show up your hand, indicate which media you come from, and you ask your question. Oui, Gérard.
Please use the mic. Please use the mic on the table. Sekana, please allow the gentleman there to ask the question first, and then you, Sekana.
Yeah, good evening, ministers and participants. My name is Basi Udo. I work for Premium Times in Nigeria. Just two questions. Number one, the issue of tax avoidance and tax evasion and incentives granted by countries in Africa. When the former president of South Africa spoke about illicit financial flows, he spoke about $138 billion being lost by African countries through some incentives granted by countries. Now, I want to know, is there any plan by the ministers that participated in this conference that countries that have lost so much, the amount of money that should go into development, is there any plans for you to come up with a concerted effort in terms of integrated arrangement where we will discourage these kind of things from continuing? Then the second one has to do with the fact that most of the monies that we lost or countries lose through tax avoidance is because of the treaties that countries approve to some of these companies, multinational companies that make away a lot of profit that is supposed to declare to the country. What is the position of the ministers in this conference to be able to discourage such companies that exploit us in this way? Thank you.
Sekana.
Merci. Moi c'est Jérôme Sekana. Je représente l'agence Galaxy Media. J'arrive de Kinshasa, en République démocratique du Congo. J'ai 4 petites préoccupations. La première, je l'adresse à Monsieur Carlos et ainsi qu'à l'ambassadeur Bachir. C'est en ce qui concerne l'agenda 2063, mais également l'agenda post-2015. À vous entendre parler, c'est une question qui concerne l'élite et les populations les plus concernées. Je ne sais pas, qu'est-ce que vous allez faire concrètement pour que ces populations puissent s'approprier cette vision, cette nouvelle vision de l'Afrique, dans la mesure où Madame la Présidente Ngozi vient d'avoir le mandat de pouvoir finaliser les concertations pour l'année prochaine. Ça, c'est la première question. La deuxième question, c'est en rapport, bien sûr, avec la taxe que vous venez de créer sur les billets d'avion, mais également sur le tourisme. Est-ce que c'est pour essayer de répondre aux besoins de l'Union africaine, c'est doté de moyens conséquents, parce que au cours de ces assises, nous avons compris que le budget de fonctionnement de l'Union africaine est financé à hauteur de 97% par les bailleurs de fonds et 3% seulement par les membres, les pays membres. Est-ce que c'est pour combler ces déficits et comment ça va se faire? La troisième préoccupation, c'est sur l'industrialisation. Je voudrais avoir des garde-fous, parce que vous demandez à l'Afrique de transformer les matières premières sur place, de leur doter la valeur ajoutée, et vous êtes sans oublier que l'Occident a besoin de ces mêmes matières premières. Comment on va résister à la pression de l'Occident qui veut aussi transformer nos matières premières de l'autre côté et donner de la valeur ajoutée là-bas afin de créer des emplois de l'autre côté? Voilà ce que j'avais comme préoccupation. Merci.
Bonsoir. Dialogue Guinée-Conakry, Orient. Moi, je voudrais avoir une idée sur la place de la femme dans cette question d'industrialisation. Parce que dans mon pays, par exemple, les femmes analphabètes font beaucoup de choses dans la vie, dans l'économie guinéenne. Quelle place pouvons-nous leur donner dans cette question d'industrialisation?
We'll give the floor to the Excellencies to answer the few questions. Carlos, please.
Let me respond to two questions, or three actually. The issue of tax evasion, the issue of what do you think, why do you think action is possible, and the issue of women and industrialization. I think the question on 2063 and post-2015 and the question on UN financing is more appropriately answered by Deputy Chairperson Moencha or Commissioner Maruping. But let me respond on the tax evasion issue. I think there are lots of efforts today to tackle the issue of tax transparency. It was the subject of the G8 meeting last, and there is also quite an important effort within the OECD to deal with the issues of tax evasion. This was prompted by developed economies' problems themselves, but it benefits us indirectly. For instance, there is legislation that has been passed in the US, the so-called Dodd-Frank Act, that is very good for us in terms of obliging the multinational companies to disclose levels of information that before were not disclosed, and therefore allowing for more transparency. A similar legislation is not yet acted upon in Europe, but there is a very strong push in that direction, and a promise by the European Commission that eventually they will do something similar to the Dodd-Frank Act. Now, this does not resolve completely the problem that was raised by President Mbeki, which is more related to mispricing than tax evasion proper. Mispricing is about not paying the real value for the commodities. And I think this is a problem that in Africa is quite pervasive, partly because of lack of competency in two fronts. The technological knowledge about how exactly the exploitation of some minerals is done, and therefore not allowing for a competent judgment of the activities that are being undertaken, and the regulatory knowledge that is also not there to avoid certain types of traps. So I think we will have, through this study that is about to be concluded, many indications of good practices in terms of mispricing. And some countries are actually doing very well, like Botswana with diamonds, has been able to increase quite significantly its capacity to master the chain, and therefore also the capacity to know what is extracted and how much is paid for it. En ce qui concerne l'action et comment croire à l'action à ce moment par rapport à des promesses qui ont été faites auparavant, moi je pense qu'il y a un certain nombre d'éléments qui sont différents actuellement. Le premier élément, c'est que nous avons à peu près 32 pays qui ont des études prospectives, soit terminées ou en cours. C'est un grand changement parce que ça montre une volonté de voir un peu, du point de vue stratégique, quelle est la place du pays dans l'avenir. Et je pense que comme nous avons eu beaucoup de progrès par rapport à la question de la dette, avec tous les efforts qui ont été faits dans la dernière décennie et la décennie d'auparavant pour réduire la dette considérablement, les pays se sont retrouvés avec un peu plus d'espace pour mener des politiques plus agressives de transformation. Mais jusqu'à maintenant, on n'a pas vu beaucoup de résultats, partiellement parce qu'il manquait cet élément de planification stratégique. Comme cet élément maintenant est à l'ordre du jour et on voit des efforts considérables qui sont menés dans la plupart du pays, moi j'ai beaucoup plus d'espoir que les pays fassent des efforts conséquents. Et je vous donne un exemple pour moi faramineux des efforts qui sont en cours. Dans la plupart des pays qui sont classés PMA, les gouvernements luttaient pour continuer à avoir la classification PMA. Parce qu'avec cette classification, ils avaient des avantages par rapport à l'aide au développement. Actuellement, les mêmes pays, et je ne dis pas tous, mais la majorité, veut sortir de la classification PMA et parle de devenir pays émergent, pays de classe moyenne, etc. Donc, il y a un changement de mentalité considérable parce que les gens se sont rendus compte que l'avenir, c'est vraiment une transformation vers une destination d'investissement plutôt que d'avoir la classification fragile d'être un pays moins avancé. Finalement, pour la question concernant la femme et l'industrialisation, je pense que la femme intervient dans toute la chaîne d'activités qu'une transformation inclusive doit avoir. D'abord, comme des entrepreneurs, nous savons que les femmes en Afrique ont une capacité entrepreneuriale très importante, mais pour cela, il faut créer les conditions pour qu'elles aient l'accès au crédit, il faut trouver les moyens de régler le problème de la propriété, surtout les questions foncières ont besoin d'être traitées avec beaucoup d'attention à la question du genre. Et nous savons que l'industrialisation en Afrique va commencer probablement en grande partie de la transformation agricole. Et là, nous savons que la femme a un rôle prépondérant dans la production agricole africaine. Donc, il va falloir les inclure depuis le début dans tous les processus de transformation. Merci.
Thank you very much, sir. The issue, yes, Madam Minister Ngozi, I think there were some issues related to you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to comment on the question on the 2063 and post-2015 agendas and how can people key into the vision, and also perhaps on the issue of the women and a little bit on the tax. I think that on the 2063 vision and post-2015, it's very important to say that a good part of the deliberations we had here included two things. One, we were concerned about industrialization and how to use that to sustain the momentum of this Africa Rising story that we talked about here. But two, we were very concerned about inclusion. And in inclusion, the fact that as we are growing, we are seeing rising inequality and some are being left behind. We talked about, the fact that we need to create more jobs for our young people, which is very important, as well as to build social safety net to catch those who may be left out. And I think that this is how our people can feel the impact. So the 2063 and post-2015 are not just documents that we are going to develop, but those documents have to contain elements of those things that we feel are left out now in terms of our growth, which must be corrected as we move forward. And those are certainly two elements that have to be part of this vision. It's not just a vision. You said a call to action. Well, we are acting already in many countries, as Carlos said, by looking at how to transform agriculture and add value. That creates jobs. Instead of exporting jobs outside, when we just export raw materials, we are creating jobs here, and that's what this is. So to me, the strong link between action, between our people, between what we say and what the vision is jobs, 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 and social safety nets. So I wanted to make that point. On the issue of the role of women in industrialization. Well, in almost all our countries in Africa, women are very, very entrepreneurial, and they are very involved at the grassroots with small and medium enterprises and micro enterprises. Here we talked about the fact that when we are doing this industrialization, we have to look at the value chain. And poor people and women must be included in this value chain so that those enterprises where women are involved and where they can add value, they must be part of the chain leading up to this major industrialization. And so it's not that SMEs or women enterprises should be left behind. We should look carefully at what stage can they become part of this movement and this change. So I think that is also very important, and we will have to study very carefully how to bring them in. Thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. Some issues were raised and directed to the African Union Commission. The Deputy Chairperson of the African Union, Mr. Erastus Mwencha, please, the floor is yours.
Maybe before I say something, let Commissioner Maruping say something because he's trying to catch his flight. And then I'll talk about the tax. He has just a footnote to add what the Minister said concerning Agenda 2063. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, DCP. Just to say, Honorable Minister is completely correct, but if I understood your question, you say how will people own those two documents? And what I want to tell you is that they belong to the people because this was bottom up. If you recall, if you were here at the opening, President Johnson Sirleaf said, people have spoken. It is for us now to do what they say we should do because these two documents come from the stakeholders, from the African stakeholders. Consultations, very wide consultations were held at various levels, and what is in those documents is what the people out there, private sector, civil society, women, youth, that's what they have. What is in there is their inputs. So the document belongs to the people. The challenge to the authorities is to see to it that those aspirations of the people out there are realized. Thank you very much.
And maybe just to add on to what the Commissioner said, the document has not been officially adopted. It will be adopted in the next summit, which will take place in June, and so it's still open. And I would invite you, as members of the Fourth Estate, also to make your contribution. Please ask for a copy and subject it to discussions and also submission of comments to enhance what my colleague has said, ownership. Now, the question from Jerome also was on tax, air tickets, and also hospitality. And you also brought in statistics, but I didn't understand what you meant, whether really this tax is meant to close the gap in terms of financing. But let me just then answer it in that broad context to say that the budget of our union has two elements, like any budget would have. There is what you call operational budget, and there is development budget. Under the development budget, that's where, as Africa Union, we support peace operations in the continent. That is where, and building an architecture for it, that's where we support infrastructure development, education, health, or trade facilitation in the continent. At the moment, on the operational budget, our member states pay fully. But I should also add something here, that our budget base is very narrow. Narrow in the sense that 5 member states pay over 60% of the budget. Putting a burden of development of the continent, over 60% of the development, on 5 countries is not the thing to do. Beyond that, on the development budget itself, what I've talked about is operational budget, which is fully paid for by the member states. It is 93% as of the budget of 2014 is funded by development partners to the tune of 93%. That is a specific figure because it varies from year to year. But if you look at overall, the overall budget, the ratio, member states' contribution is 42% and development partners is 58%. Now, for many years now, our leaders have been looking at how to move away from this dependence, particularly on development partners, on our budget. Studies have been conducted to look at various options, and a number of options were considered. Eventually, 2 were retained by the summit that was held in May last year. And the summit then, of course, asked ministers of finance whose competence is squarely in their portfolio to see how this budget then could be raised from that, the 2 options. So what the ministers have said, they now want then to operationalize this by looking into the modalities of implementation. Now, let me say something here about this specific tax. We are talking of, for a ticket coming into or out of Africa, $10. If you think of a ticket, say from here now, Lagos, to UK, where I would expect, or to Germany, or to France, or to Dubai, that ticket costs more than $1,000. And just to put 10 shillings on it, it's a very minor, impact on the ticket. But the revenue that it will collect is substantial because of the number of people that travel. And that then will be used to assist in the development of these areas that I've talked about: infrastructure, trade, agriculture, wherever it is in the continent. I hope you got the message right.
Very much, Excellency. Your Excellency, Yogoda was mentioned in one of the questions. Please, can you address the issue that was addressed to you?
Yeah, I think he mentioned my name, but I think the Minister of Finance has addressed that issue. But just to add, the idea of the 2063 is for Africa to develop a plan. What do we do in the next 50 years as a continent? We're talking about industrialization. We're talking about technology. How do we adopt the technology? How do we make it sustainable? How can we make it affordable? So it is a roadmap for us as a continent and as a guide to achieve that. And on the, I think that has been adequately answered. And on the post-2015 agenda, we're talking about sustainability on the achievements already recorded under the MDG goals. So how do we move forward? 2015 is just around the corner. So as a continent, we develop common African position. That position is very simple. How do we eradicate poverty in all its ramifications? That's the simple thing about post-2015. Thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. We are taking the last round, and it will be just 3 questions. Let's take the last round because the people here will go to the airport. They're waiting. They have to take their flight. We have 1, 2, 3, 4. 2 rounds. The last round, please. And be fast. Just 1 question per journalist, please. Oui, André, s'il vous plaît. Présentez d'abord et vous posez rapidement votre question. Une seule question par personne, s'il vous plaît.
Je m'appelle André Gakwaya de l'Agence rwandaise d'information. Et le ministre français des Finances a dit que grâce aux matières premières qui viennent d'Afrique, la France est capable de créer 200 000 emplois grâce à leurs industries de transformation. Et par contre, nous, en Afrique, nous voulons transformer par l'industrialisation nous-mêmes. Ce qui fait que nous allons refuser des emplois à ces pays occidentaux. Nous sommes... Alors, est-ce qu'il ne va pas y avoir une force qui... D'accord, nous devons travailler pour gagner, faire vivre nos populations. C'est notre droit. Mais est-ce que vous ne voyez pas, dans le cadre des partenariats, une certaine lutte qui est engagée entre nous et l'Occident? Comment allez-vous contrer, stratégie que vous adoptez pour contrer, défendre votre...
La question, s'il vous plaît, André. Pas de commentaires. Question. Allez-y.
Oui, et ma question c'est celle-ci. Alors, dans cette lutte qui est engagée en quelque sorte, nous sommes dans une lutte économique. Alors, comment vous allez vous y prendre pour mieux défendre votre peuple? Merci.
Next question. There, Omar.
Thank you. Omar Radi, a freelance journalist from Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. From various documents and from various discussions regarding the development of Africa, including the economic report just launched this afternoon, there is this trend that shows from the immediate independence, the immediate years following independence to the current decade, that there has been a lack of sustainability in the economic policy, in the performance of various African countries. Have you discussed that issue of sustainability in policy directions pursued throughout successive regimes in Africa? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Kwesi, please, your question.
Thank you. My name is Kwesi Obin, Assistant Editor, African Agenda, based in Accra, Ghana. My question, it's one, but I would want a part to be answered by Minister Ngozi and the other by the AU and UNECA, if you don't mind. My question to the UNECA and AU is simply, in the conversations, in the discussions, in the meeting, and indeed in the document referenced in this communique, there is a particular take on, say, value addition in terms of natural resources, and that whole theory of value addition to natural resources. And I'm wondering, and also on the back of that, you have an increasing scholarship on the fact that that really is not helpful or hasn't helped a lot of countries that are naturally endowed. I'm wondering what model of industrialization, particularly those that are natural resource endowed, that you would recommend, given that that conversation was not had, and yet people have left here with the thought that they can use their natural resources to industrialize. So I want you to comment on a model or the models that you would suggest, particularly those with natural resources. Secondly, Minister Ngozi, you referred to the return of President Jonathan and President Sirleaf from Abidjan to the meeting. Well, they went on a meeting over the economic partnership agreements, to which West Africa and indeed the various regions of Africa are having to sign with the Europeans. What is Nigeria's take? Is Nigeria going to sign the EPA in its current form? And if West Africa goes ahead, what are the implications for regional integration, for industrialization in the region? Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Carlos Lopez, I think you will be the first to take.
I'm going to be very brief on the issue of Minister of France, if I can take that one, at least in part. What he said is that if they double their trade with Africa, they will increase their labor force by 200,000. He didn't say it was 200,000 out of natural resources exploitation, just to set the record straight. But I think the thrust of your question is basically about how do we export these jobs rather than create jobs ourselves with our commodities. And I think Kwesi's question about value addition from natural resources is somehow related. Now, what I would like to say, this is not to divert from the question, is that the entire report that the EU ECA did last year has the title Commodity-Based Industrialization. It's all about explaining the model. Now we don't have the time here in the press conference to go through all the details of that, but that's precisely the question that is answered in that report, so I invite you to read it. The thrust of it is basically that value addition is possible if you take the vantage point that we control a certain number of commodities in terms of global market, and therefore it is possible to change regulatory systems to favor that industrialization. Thank you.
As a means of conclusion, Minister Ngozi, if you are busy, maybe the AUC can take the questions that were directed. Okay, Mr. Ngozi, please.
Thank you very much. You're quite right that the two presidents came back from a meeting of the ECOWAS, and there's going to be on the EPA, among other issues. It wasn't the only one. And they are going to Brussels very soon to discuss. The conclusions of that meeting, which may already be publicly available, is that some member states have some issues. And so it has been decided that it will take a bit more time to go into those issues and study them and come back with a resolution so that the process can move forward. And so I think we don't have a conclusion yet from the ECOWAS. So let us see how we move forward on those issues after the studies have taken place. I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
Conclusion from the AUC side, please.
There is not much to add. I think Carlos has clearly said that to try and explain the model here would require as much time as the meeting has taken, because if you look at the meeting, we talked about industrialization and talked about many things, but specifically on raw materials. I thought I would rephrase your question differently, because unless there was a problem of interpretation, but you were speaking in English, I heard you saying that countries have not benefited from adding value to the raw material endowments that they have. Far from that. What we are saying, in the case of Ghana, as you know, we have been saying don't export cocoa beans, but make them to chocolate, because the moment you are adding value, instead of going to create jobs where that cocoa beans are processed, you create jobs in Ghana. And that is part of industrialization that is inclusive, that is transformative. I thought I would just emphasize that point to drive the message home for you. But the rest, as he said, the whole meeting was concerned on strategies which focus on very many aspects of industrialization.